Welcome to week 7 for ED 2491. The focus of this week's presentation will be our students and how they like to learn. As each of you are learners, and you will be in this role for life I hope, you already have some idea on how it is you like to learn or learn best. Well, that is what we will be concentrating on in week 7. We will examine a whole variety of teaching approaches and strategies that are particularly informed by the Constructivist school, where learners actively construct their own meaning. In other words, they are autonomous learners in which they have control of what they learn and how they learn it. By the end of this week, you should be able to explain the differences between a teacher-centered approach to teaching and a learner-centered approach. You will design lesson plans that use a learner-centered approach, describe the steps required in planning small group activities, describe examples of structured collaborative learning, for example using Think, Pair, Share as a learning strategy, or jigsaw, placemat and role play as teaching approaches. You'll also explain the strengths and weaknesses of any approaches or strategies that you use in your learner-centered lesson plans. What is essential to understand at this point in time is that a learner-centered approach to learning is primarily constructivist. This is because constructivist learning theories focus on the student and how they construct meaning. So, you're probably wondering, how does a constructivist approach look like in the classroom? Well, teachers in a constructivist classroom would plan lessons by setting outcomes and designing instructional activities to match their students' prior knowledge, motivations and level of interest. Teachers will consistently evaluate their students' learning and adjust their teaching and learning accordingly. For these reasons, lessons and learning materials are modified continuously on the basis of student feedback. In other words, in a constructivist teaching approach, the teacher would not be able to teach with the same materials over and over again. It would not be catering towards the learning needs of their students. There are multiple constructivist learning and teaching approaches and strategies that can be used, and these are known as problem-based learning, collaborative learning, and small group work, and plus many others. But for now, I'm going to go through some of these teaching approaches. So firstly, let's look at small group work. It sounds quite simple when you first look at this strategy, but in practice, working well in small groups does not come naturally. It in fact involves the students having acquired many skills to be able to work with each other, as you no doubt have experienced in group activities while studying at university. Some people have acquired much more skills in working collaboratively with others. So, therefore, in order to be effective group work members, each member has to have a set of values and beliefs in order to be able to work effectively within the group. They also require knowledge of the skills and protocols to be able to work collaboratively, and these need to be explicitly taught. For this reason, knowing your learners is very important. So, to sum up, key aspects that you will need to think about when using small group work as a teaching approach. These are the purpose of the lesson or activity and making sure that this approach is clear to your students. You also need to think about the resources you will need, such as time, the composition of the group, the roles in the group, and the norms of the group. And how do you want the group members to behave? The processes, what do you want the group to actually do? And the assessment. How are you going to figure out that the group members have learnt what you intended them to learn? All of these factors must be considered when planning a group work activity. Once again, this will become automatic with experience and won't feel as prolonged as it does right now. So don't worry, we all need to begin with these small steps. The next constructivist approach is called cooperative learning. Johnson describes 5 elements of cooperative learning that distinguish it from other kinds of small group work. They outline how cooperative learning encourages positive interdependence, where students work on a clear task with a group goal and all the students must make a contribution or the goal cannot be achieved. Cooperative learning also encourages individual and group accountability. The group is accountable for achieving its goals, and each individual member is accountable for a particular identifiable contribution. In this approach, there is also face-to-face interaction, where students interact with each other face-to-face as part of the task. They discuss problems, explain their learning to each other, and tease out ideas. It is not possible simply to divide up the work and do it without further interaction within a cooperative learning context. There is also specific focus that is needed to develop within a cooperative learning environment. There is specific focus on interpersonal and small group skills such as attentive listening, questioning to clarify ideas, eliciting responses, or disagreeing in a constructive way. And these kind of skills all need to be explicitly taught, as their development is not left to chance. Lastly, cooperative learning encourages group processing and reflection, whereby groups reflect on their cooperative learning skills they have used and consciously focus on developing their skills in working together. As you can no doubt see, including all these elements creates the best conditions for students to benefit from in small group learning situations. Now, the third approach is guided discovery. This is where the teacher does not tell students what they will be learning or how they will be learning. A mystery journey, if you like, is designed for students so that they can discover the knowledge for themselves. It is guided because the teacher knows exactly where she or he wants the students to go and therefore provides the steps for them to get to that particular situation or learning context. It can be used in most, if not all, lessons. Just ensure that you conclude each lesson by ensuring that students understand the point of the lesson. This is very important and is often skipped due to time constraints, but this is where the learning is really cemented. The fourth learning approach is called inquiry learning. This is a model of inquiry that includes the following number of phases. There is firstly identifying the issue, then framing and focusing the questions. This is followed by identifying possible relevant evidence and then collecting and organising the evidence. The students then analyse and evaluate the evidence. They synthesise and report conclusions, possibly taking action, and finally reflecting upon the consequences and outcomes of each of the above phases. As you can probably tell, this kind of approach to learning is much more suited to upper primary and high school contexts, but can be used across the board as long as it's done effectively. There is also problem-based learning. This is the fifth approach in this week's learning guide. Group work is a major part of the problem-based learning approach, as you can probably tell. It includes 5 important phases. These are orientation, organisation, investigation, presentation, and evaluation. Orientation requires a teacher to communicate the outcomes of the lesson, describe logistical requirements, and motivate the students. The organisation stage requires a teacher to define and organise study tasks related to the problem in the scenario. Then follows the investigation phase that encourages students to gather information, conduct experiments if relevant, and search for explanations and solutions. The students then get to present their results in the presentation stage. The teacher will still play a role at this stage and assist students to plan and prepare artefacts such as reports, videos, models, and multimedia so work can be shared with their partners, or they can exhibit their work to the class. Finally, the problem-based approach entails the evaluation phase. The teacher again will help his or her students reflect on their investigations and processes. These series of phases, as you can probably tell, are rigorous and encourage a much more active role for the learner. It is certainly not a passive approach and is one of my favourite approaches to teaching and learning, as I find that children and adults or individuals of all ages enjoy solving problems, and that makes the learning more purposeful. The final approaches are called authentic and play-based learning. Now, authentic learning applies to any complex learning environment in which students can conduct learning activities that reflect the situation to which the learning is to be eventually applied. So, what does this mean? Well, how I remember it best is that authentic learning is learning that can be applied in the real world. And it is unlikely to have a student complain about this type of learning, especially, and you probably remember this yourself when you're going to school or when you have been in the classroom, where a student may say, you know, how does this, what I'm doing right now, apply to my real world? Well, with an authentic task, a student is very unlikely to say this. So, for example, looking into the early childhood context, If students were creating a dish, say macaroni and cheese, within the classroom, they would immediately be able to apply this kind of learning to their home environment, which means it's authentic because it can be immediately applied. So the final approach is called play-based learning, and it is it is basically how it sounds. It is learning through play. Learning through play is the most constructive form of learning. In fact, if you are not playing, I believe, you are unlikely to keep learning. And this is true for children all the way through to adults of any age. I think that this learning through play is one of the most constructive ways of learning, because when a child or an adult is playing, and I'm using play in the most broadest sense of the word, literally to mean enjoying and having fun while they're learning, they are much more likely to continue learning and to absorb what they are learning. Now, in this week's tutorial workshop or discussion board, you will choose one of the approaches or strategies that you'll write about in your personal journal. You will need to use the following format for your snapshot. So you're going to include your teaching strategy or approach, the context, such as the student's age, key learning area and topic, the purpose or learning outcomes you would like to achieve, a description of how you'd like to implement it, and secondly, you'll also post one comment of useful critique about someone else's strategy, about 1 to 2 sentences. So in this week's video, I've decided to add some of my thoughts on the discussion board posts and interaction that I'm seeing inside the forums, particularly as we're just past the halfway point in this subject. Firstly, I'd like to tell you that I'm really impressed by most of your contributions, particularly when you relate what you're learning to your real-world experiences. This is great and something that I strongly encourage, as you no doubt have seen me comment along the way. I am also impressed by your attempts to define what you are learning in your own words, and you are all making sense of some very abstract concepts, so well done. I think this is absolutely wonderful and certainly cements the learning for your peers and for me as well. What I would like to see a lot more of is actual responding to your peers' contributions. So what I mean by that is actually taking what your peer has said in a previous post and relating it to your own post. In this way, what you add is like a continuity of your peers' ideas. For example, if your fellow student teacher has posted some examples of how the concepts are illustrated in their lives, and you're about to post your perception of how those very same concepts are illustrated in your life, you will add yours, but you'll do so in response to your peer, or what they have contributed. In this way, it becomes a lot more readable for both the next person that is going to respond and for anyone reading over the discussion. It can be very distracting, and you've probably experienced this yourself, to read posts that are added one after the other, but there's no connection between them. In other words, no continuity. I think that this is what makes a discussion board forum worthwhile and so much more engaging. So what I would really like is for you to post your thoughts on what I've just said in the comment section on YouTube, or directly email me. I'm curious to see what you think about this as well. So the personal journal. In this week's personal journal entry, you'll reflect on constructivist learning theories and related teaching approaches and strategies. This will mean you need to read Orlick and Marsh. You'll then need to write yourself a checklist of what you have to think of in lesson planning when using small groups. You are advised to use this checklist every time you plan a lesson. If after giving a lesson you realise that something was missing in your checklist, then you just need to add it, and it becomes basically a work in progress. In the next task, you'll compile another checklist that you'll use after you've used small group work in a classroom. This checklist could be a list of questions that will make you think about how effective the learning was, how effective you were during the part of the lesson, and in retrospect, how effective was your planning. This list is designed to frame your lesson reflections when you are on your professional experience. Therefore, it must be done, but you'll see why it's so important when you begin constructing it, and it's definitely worthwhile. Further on to your personal journals, there's quite a bit in your personal journal this week. You'll also need to read Barry and King carefully before reflecting on the following questions. What was it that students discovered in your lesson? What was it about the activity that was guided? Do you think the teacher knew in advance what the students would have discovered? Is true discovery occurring in this kind of lesson? In what ways is guided discovery similar to direct instruction, or how is it different? You'll also create your own teaching toolkit or repertoire. To do this, you'll need to carefully read page 11 of the Week 7 Learning Guide for further instructions. I can't emphasise this last point enough. The Learning Guide will be pivotal this week in particular to understanding how to do your personal journal entries. So to sum up Week 7, Constructivist teaching and learning strategies are a very learner-centred approach. I think we understand that now. Constructivist learning approaches include small group activities, cooperative learning, problem-based learning, and many more teaching strategies. And lastly, the Constructivist learning approach involves the learner taking a much more active approach to their learning. In fact, you'll find in your teaching career that this type of learning puts the onus on the student to take responsibility for their own learning. And that is a key skill for students in a postmodern world where individuals need to be independent and engaged in lifelong learning, where they literally need to actively seek out their own information and what they need to learn, as you no doubt are experiencing yourselves and will experience for many years in the future. So that's it for this video on Week 7. If you have any further questions or suggestions, please see the Learning Guide, the subject outline, Learn JCU and Facebook for further contact details and information about this subject, or you can contact me directly by email. So thank you for listening to Week 7 Learner-Centered Strategies. Next week I'll present a video for Week 8 called Student Motivation and Engagement. Please subscribe and comment, as any feedback is very appreciated. Thank you. Bye for now.